Welcome. Welcome everyone. It's lovely to see everyone's faces, and it feels like potentially we're getting closer to seeing everyone like actual face to face, which is very exciting. Although this is nice because we get to have everyone from across the country all dialing into the same meeting. So I guess first thing I wanted to do was just an acknowledgement of country, and actually Suruchi or Super, is it one of you guys controlling the slide pack there? Yeah, great. Yeah, so today I'm in Drummoyne, just a little bit west of, or inner west of Sydney as it's called. So I'm on Wonga land, but wanted to acknowledge that we meet on Aboriginal lands and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, and show our respects and hope that today's deliberations and engagement would be pleasing to them. A few housekeeping things that I just wanted to take us through. Looks like everyone's got their video on, which is great. We're big fans of video in NABERS, even though it can become a bit tiring, but I think a new group trying to have some engagement, chat with you, see what your feelings are, you know, if it's really bad or if it's great, that really helps. Mute yourselves. Everyone, I think, is getting pretty familiar with this. I was on the call this morning with my for my kindergarten daughter's graduation, and most of the parents and grandparents had not muted themselves, and so we were unable to hear anything that happened during the graduation, but it looked okay. So the purpose of today is just to give you a bit of an update. So this is number 2 of advisory panel meetings of 4. The next one's going to be in March. So, you know, and the purpose of what we're doing here is creating a new NABERS rating product for residential aged care and retirement living. And so this is a bit of an update of how we're traveling with that, but, you know, and that might be, it is what it is, but we really are keen to get some of your feedback on it today. So we're going to take you through a bit of a project update. We're going to take you through how the data analysis is going with our consultants DeltaQ, who are also here and are going to be presenting to you today. And that's where we really want to get a bit of feedback, because we're starting to see what the numbers are telling us, and we want to also get your kind of read on, is that right or wrong? And we've got some really specific and some broader questions to ask you about that. And then we're going to also tell you about how to get the most from your NABERS rating, because we're getting closer to actually having this in market sort of mid next year, and also what some existing sectors are doing with their ratings and how they're using it to drive really exciting improvements. The last thing I have to mention is that we will be recording this meeting. So, you know, if that's a problem, please let us know ASAP. Otherwise, we're going to record it, and that's so that we can show this generally internally to other people, and they can see what we've talked about. So that's really it from me. I'm now going to hand over. Oh, actually, there was one more thing, wasn't there? No, there wasn't. Here's the attendees. We'll send out the slide pack, and I'm now going to hand over to you, Supra, and Supra is going to give you a bit of a project update before DeltaQ takes us through the data analysis. So over to you, Supra.
Thanks, James. Hello, everybody. Hope you can all hear me all right. Let me know with some angry faces if you can't. So yes, I think in the last meeting we talked about who we are as a program, what we do, and then also our impact, particularly in the offices and shopping center sectors, and how we essentially want to emulate that in the residential aged care and retirement living sectors. We also talked about how we are typically used in the built environment, which often goes beyond just the energy efficiency and water efficiency measurement. And this is what we will again go through in a bit later on. And then we also looked at what does NABERS expanding to the residential aged care and retirement living sectors look like. So just as a very quick update, or a quick overview rather. So NABERS, we are a national government program, and we at its core rate the operational performance of buildings on a 6-star rating scale. Operational performance primarily includes energy ratings and water ratings. So that is the focus for residential aged care and retirement living at this stage. This also relates to the use of actual metered data through utility bills and sub-meters, which give an accurate reflection of the operational performance of different buildings. We are based on a star rating scale, which is a very easy to understand and communicate metric, where 0 or 1 star indicates poor performance and highlights a lot of scope of improvement, and a 6-star rating scale indicates market leading performance. This is also a star rating scale that is widely understood by the built environment and also the peripheral organizations, so the likes of banks and real estate agents and so on. And we work with different building sectors, so offices, shopping centers, hotels, data centers, and so on. And as part of our 5-year strategic plan, one of the goals is to expand NABERS to all major building types. And we are kicking that off with residential aged care and retirement living, which is fantastic. And this is what that looks like. So we're right now in the technical benchmarking phase. The purpose of benchmarking is to really ensure that all buildings are fairly treated in a given sector under the NABERS rating assessments, where the idea is to identify the different factors that have an impact on the energy or water usage profiles and subsequently adjust for those. And these could be climate or size or operational characteristics and so on. And DeltaQ, Grace and Paul will talk in a bit more detail on this in the subsequent section. And the entire benchmarking is based on a rigorous data collection piece. So a massive thank you to all those who have provided us with the data or are in the process of providing us with the data. It is a bit of an iterative process where we've now finished almost the first phase of data collection that has moved into the benchmarking, and those are the results and some of the outcomes and discussions that we will share and discuss today. And then at the back of that, we're also collecting some more data, which will again feed into the benchmarking and so on. And then looking ahead, we've got the rules development. So this is for our independent accredited assessors who will be doing the rating assessments. And it provides all details of how to do rating assessments with the intention to make sure that all ratings are accurately and consistently done. And then we've got the trial ratings. So once we've completed the benchmarking and rules, where we'll get around 10 to 15 sites across residential aged care and retirement living sectors, and simulate the rating process from start to finish and test how our benchmarks and rules are working, and then make any changes as required. And this is where we are coming to this group to nominate some of your sites potentially to participate in the trial ratings. And again, Grace from DeltaQ will again talk a bit on that. The opportunity there is to be one of the first residential aged care or retirement living sites in Australia to have a NABERS rating. And then towards the end of the financial year, we work on developing and delivering the assessor training. So this is essentially working on having the infrastructure in place, so having trained assessors, as well as our online platform where we can process and certify ratings. So once all of that is up and running, that's when we will formally launch the rating products for these two sectors. So that's a bit on where we are at and what's next. I'll now hand over to Paul to take us through data analysis and benchmarking. Paul, over to you.
Okay, so I'm going to very briefly talk about the process of data analysis and benchmarking. If you can flip to the next slide. So starting point with any benchmarking system is having a common definition of what it is we're benchmarking. That is defined largely by where the utility metering sits and what it covers. Based on our understanding of the sector, we've defined the coverage for retirement living and residential aged care. For retirement living, it's effectively the site minus the independent living units, because either, depending on which state you're in, those are separately metered, or they are on an embedded network and charged out. So to get the common section, we're basically talking about a sort of pool, gym, clubhouse, community center, street lights, any on-site laundry, and any on-site catering facility. So effectively, as I say, everything that isn't the independent living units. That does mean also that we expect that serviced units, so serviced apartments within the retirement living would be within coverage, which from our experience of sites is the case. Residential aged care is a little bit simpler because residential aged care sites tend to be a standalone single meter building. And so we're basically dealing with everything. So everything in the building, consulting rooms, bedrooms, common rooms, laundry, catering, basically everything that's there. So the boundaries for residential aged care are relatively straightforward. Next slide. Super. Thanks. So the process of benchmarking is about developing some sort of concept of average so that we can compare a site against average. The challenge is that we have a wide range of factors that contribute to energy consumption and to water consumption. So average is not simple. We can't just use a per meter squared figure or something like that, because that doesn't take account of functional differences between sites. So benchmarking is about creating an average, but about creating an average that's more intelligent than just a single per meter squared figure or per unit figure. So what we do is we look at the data for energy use and water use and compare that with the factors that determine that we believe are causal. So that might be the number of residents or the number of independent living units, or the floor area, or the site area, or the presence of particular facilities. And we use statistics to identify which of those has the strongest influence. And then once we've corrected for that strongest influence, we adjust for some of the secondary influences to get effectively an equation that says, given these characteristics of a site, this is what the average consumption is. And then our benchmarking is a process of comparing your actual site with that average benchmark, with using the same input data as your site. And that process underlies all the NABERS ratings, and it gives you some comfort that what's happening in the rating is that we are comparing you against your peers. So you're comparing your site against a site that has an equivalent range of functionality, equivalent size, an equivalent site. So that's basically benchmarking. Super. So do we have any questions on the principles of benchmarking, or indeed any of the earlier material?
Look, I might just jump in to say, this is the start of a number of questions or periods we're asking for your input. And whereas last time we used Slido, this time we're just going to use the chat. So we'd love to take your questions in the chat. Otherwise, if you want to, just jump in and ask away. So are there any questions?
No, not yet, Paul. We're going to have lots of them, I think, when we move to residential aged care and specifically retirement living. Please, go ahead.
Great.
Excellent. So Supra, I think before we talk about the spread of data that has been provided so far, it might be useful for us to run a poll, or at least test the Zoom polling function. So Supra, if you could just run the first poll, it will give us an indication of the stakeholders that are in this room, and also the extent of your experience with NABERS.
Yeah, I'm having a Zoom moment, so not able to run it. Suruchi, can you try running the poll if you can see it from your end?
Okay, looks like, Grace, we're having a little bit technical issue here. Can we move on to the next page? So, yeah.
We can see the poll from this side.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we can go. Let's have a go.
Yeah. Cool. it did launch, thankfully.
Hi team, it's Rita. I'm having problems actually submitting. I'm pressing submit, but it doesn't seem to want to take the information.
Sorry, Rita. That's the beauty of technology.
Is anyone else having issues submitting?
Yes.
There's a few heads going up and down.
Yeah, I think Sue is having problem as well. But
I
we're
think you
having a
just
lot
need
of
to
fences come in.
Yeah.
Scroll down. If you scroll down, I also had that issue. It's just scrolling down on the, because you automatically try to submit, but if you scroll down, you'll see there are multiple questions to answer.
Yes, mine submitted as well.
Cool.
We hit submit and it took a little while for it to actually do it.
Okay. Supra, when you're ready, you can close that off and share the results.
Yeah, I can do that on. Yeah, I can do that, Grace. So should I end the polling?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Excellent. So actually, this is interesting because I think it will reflect the spread of the data that you can see that's been provided to us so far. We have a lot of you that work with ACT and New South Wales sites, particularly for residential aged care. But it's also actually quite nice to see that we still do have some stakeholders working in Victoria, Queensland, Tasmania, Western Australia, South Australia, and Northern Territory. And you will see that at the end of this, we'll probably put out a call for extra data, if you could, to give us a little bit more variety and diversity in the sites that we're analyzing here. And as Paul mentioned before, the main idea behind benchmarking is to make sure that all sites are being fairly treated. So the more data you can provide, the better it is. I am a little bit surprised with some people that have said none of the above, so I'm not quite sure what that means. Perhaps you are a policymaker and not involved in that. We have a similar trend for retirement living, so I won't go through that. But also with question number 3 is quite interesting that more than half of you are familiar with the NABERS rating tools. So hopefully it makes it easier when we talk about trial ratings and the concept behind the 6 stars metric is not that unfamiliar to you. Okay, so just looking, thank you, Suruchi. So just looking at the spread of data provided so far, thank you very much. We've received close to 240 site data to date. And even as I speak on a daily basis, we're still receiving extra data. So thank you for that. Most of our sites for aged care, actually all of our sites for aged care, should I say, that's the one in teal is currently in New South Wales. So if you own sites in different states, it would be great to provide it to us. We also had a nice spread of retirement living. What we're really interested here, it's not just about the states, but also more importantly about the different climatic differences between our sites as well. And finally, in green, you can see that we actually do have a good number of sites that are co-located sites. And what that means is that you have a mixture of both retirement living facilities on site, as well as aged care, residential aged care facilities on site. And later on, we're going to ask you a question about some of our assumptions about co-located sites and whether it is actually valid. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's start off with residential aged care. Next slide. The very first question that we needed to ask was to say, what is the primary or first order effect variable that we can use to scale all of your emissions, which comprises of electricity, gas, and diesel or oil, if you use them, as well as water consumption to explain most of that differences in your facilities fill and water consumption. So there were a couple of things that we looked at. We looked at gross floor area. We also looked at number of aged care places. So that's the maximum registered capacity of your facility. And what we found was that Well, there is some correlation with gross floor areas. It's not presented on the slides here. We had some concerns about the quality and the consistency between how gross floor area is defined between organizations and between sites. So what we settled on was to look at the number of aged care places, which looked like the most robust and most consistent metric that was available for all sites. On the image on the graph on the left there, that is the relationship between annual emissions of all of your sites compared to the number of aged care places. So as we expect, as the number of aged care places being offered increases towards the right, we can also see a corresponding increase in annual emissions. So it's moving the right direction. Now, Paul introduced you to the concept of statistics and also the concept of the R-squared value. And that's meant to tell us how strong or how significant that relationship that you see is. And we want the R-squared value to be as close as possible to 1. And what we can see with our current work done so far for residential aged care is that the number of aged care places actually explains up to about 45% of annual emissions between sites. So that's a positive. On the right side there, we present the same information, but for annual water consumption. Similarly, we see that as the number of aged care places increases, we see a corresponding increase in annual water consumption. So looking across the close to about 117 sites or so of data provided to us, we can see that the number of aged care places explains about 50% of your site's water consumption. Next slide, please. Now, we've talked about how the primary scale variable in terms of number of aged care places explains about 45% to 50% of your annual emissions and annual water consumption. What we tried to look for was to say, well, what else could explain that variation in annual emissions and water consumption? So here were a few things that we looked at. We looked at gross floor area per resident, just in case there was a different level of, I guess, floor area that you provide between facilities per resident. When we looked at it, the R-squared value was less than 0.05, which tells us that when R-squared is 0, it means that there's no correlation between the variables at all. And so this tells us that it's not really an effect that we're looking at for aged care facilities. We applied the process and repeated it for weekly prepared meals on site. As expected, very low correlation because most sites prepare three meals a day for your residents. We also looked at other facilities like lifts, heated swimming pools, and mechanically ventilated car parks, as well as the processing of heavy laundry, which is things like your sheets, your blankets on site. Now, with those variables, we didn't have sort of numbers. So with meals, you have 10 meals, 20 meals, 300 meals. With lifts, it's either yes or no. With heated swimming pools, similar. So instead of looking at R-squared, we looked at something called a t-test, which basically tells us how different the annual emissions, for example, between a site with lifts and a site without lifts might be. Now, when we say NA, all of our results came up with no, there is no real statistical difference between a site with these facilities and a site without those facilities. And that's why they're struck out at the moment. So this means that we've only been able to explain up to about half of the annual emissions and annual water consumption on site. There is a question that we'll pose to you shortly after to say, what else? What else are we not considering and our assumptions correct? There is another thing to note here with the heated swimming pools and the mechanically ventilated car parks. We're only talking about a sample size or observations of 2 to 3. So we only have 2 sites with swimming pools at this stage and only 3 sites with mechanically ventilated car parks. So it's probable, or there is a potential that if you provide us with more data with sites that have those facilities, we may find a different trend. Next slide, please. So I just want to open up the floor for discussion now. There are 3 questions that we'll go through. So the first question that we would like to find out from you is, beyond those variables that we've just gone through, what else have we missed that might explain that gap, that 50% gap, to explain the annual emissions and annual water consumption on site? NABERS team, do you have anything else to add?
The one thing I would add is that, you know, we're talking about R values and correlations, and a lot of you may not be familiar with that is, but the value of 1, which is like the maximum correlation you can have, is actually impossible to achieve. So we're not looking for an R value that is 1 at all, because we could never get that, even having perfect information about, you know, 1,000 variables. So I think the R values that we're getting at the moment are actually not poor R values, but what we're looking for is, are there some variables or factors that maybe we're not considering yet that could make a difference in a building getting, you know, a good rating or a poor rating that we're not factoring at the moment? Maybe a type of facility that we're not thinking right now. But I just want to put that in context, that that we're not necessarily that far away from having high quality benchmarks.
Yeah, I'll just leave it with you, and hopefully we get to talk soon and wrap up the registration.
Is that somebody asking a question? Just can't.
No, sorry, Carlos. I think it's someone not on mute. But yeah, that's fine now. Thanks, Carlos. Can I pull Rita? Can I get some thoughts from you? What do you think? Any other variables which might be, you know, which we are missing here?
Sure. Love to go first. Okay, just thinking about perhaps the type of bedroom accommodation setup, whether we're talking about single bedrooms versus maybe shared bedrooms, where you may only have 1 aircon unit in a shared bedroom, so it's got a higher number of actual beds grouped together around 1 aircon unit versus a single room with a single aircon unit. Also thinking maybe about, look, I'm not sure about, you know, water consumption in terms of whether there's extensively large garden areas that are reticulated off the mains rather than any other water source for water. That's a couple of ideas, just top of my head.
Yeah, no, that's great. Michael, I think you're adding something on the comments there. Michael, would you like to also add something? I think you're on mute, Michael.
Yep. You can hear me now? Yep. Yeah, I agree with the amount of beds per room. Certainly for the older facilities, whether we have, it can be up to 4 beds in a room and 1 bathroom rather than 1 bathroom, 1 bed, 1 bathroom sort of room in a more modern, like, stuff that's been constructed over the last 10 years. And so the variable, it's almost, there's a correlation between the age of the building and the amount of beds per room. The older ones are typically like the old, almost institutionalized hospital we have, might have 4 beds per room. And we don't have many of them left because people just don't want to move into them, but there is still a few in the system. Yeah, so that's right. 2 ones which we didn't pick up. And certainly stuff we did with NABERS and with the state government about 4 or 5 years ago did pick up age of buildings as a key factor.
Thanks, Michael. Grace, I'll leave it to you to take on to further questions. And I think there are quite great insights in here from Rita and Michael about the age we should be noting. Grace?
Yep, Great. No, thank you. Thank you for the suggestions. And
I think Rita wants to raising her hand. Rita.
Sorry, I don't know where I don't use Zoom very often, so I can't see where you actually put your hand up like in Teams. I'm just thinking the occupancy as well, because something when Michael mentioned about, you know, some of the older buildings having 4 beds in one room. That is correct. We have some of those homes as well, but we've derated the rooms. So whilst our maximum occupancy may show in some cases, you know, the full number that the home can take, because of its, you know, it's not, you know, not suitable to the market, we may not be filling all of those 4 beds at any one time. So the occupancy or the per occupied bed days, you know, is possibly another tool, another rating metrics you might consider.
No, that's a good suggestion. We did look at the relationship between occupied bed days and the number of the aged care capacity or aged care places that's registered, and there was a very strong correlation, which meant that they were almost, it was basically the same variable. But it's certainly something we can look into again as we get more data to see if that changes. Is getting occupied bed days, if we were to request that data as a scaling variable, would that be data that's easily obtainable by everyone for NABERS rating?
I am seeing a few small nods and a few like, eh. Does that about sum it up? Maybe not super easy to get. Can anyone elaborate on that?
Yeah.
We can get it because we need to report other financials based on it, so we can get it.
Okay.
Okay, great. And Luke, I think you were saying something, but we couldn't hear you, and we still can't. Okay.
I was wondering if I could jump in as well.
Please, Alex.
Sorry, I missed a little bit of that conversation before, but I think aged care and retirement living, we see them similar to other building classes. You know, the occupants are stuck there or remain there for the 24-hour period, and they could be there for a long time. So really, the services are running constantly to satisfy the comfort and provide amenity to the occupants. Is similar to a hotel or something like that. And when we look at the hotel rating tool, the variable is generally the level of amenity that's provided to the occupants or customers. Hotels have a star rating system which has been used for the development of the rating tool. But aged care and retirement living, do they have a amenity rating or evaluation of the level of amenity that the occupants get? You know, is there some kind of equivalent? I know you said that laundry and whatnot doesn't have an impact, but what are the other amenities like swimming pools, large common areas, all those other premium facilities, services that the occupants may get if they pay more or decide to move into a aged care facility with more premium services than a budget one that's got much less and has a different sort of market designation. So that, yeah, just that question about services would be interesting to discuss.
Can I just say something on that one? Something along with the amenity could be of the level of care provided. So whether they have 24-hour nursing staff there, how many are there? Is it running almost more like a hospital because there's such level of critical care there, or is it really there's just a casual nurse that's there a couple of hours a day? That type of level of service too could be one of the variables that would be interesting to note, because I know that at sites with a higher level of care, just from my speaking to one of the bigger aged care providers, they said they use a lot more water on that site because they've got a higher level of sort of patient care there.
We looked at it in our initial, or if some of you will know that we went through multiple stages of data collections to try to minimize the number of variables that we collect for data. And I think we did initially ask about the number of carers, should I say, and it was strongly correlated to the number of places at the time, so we decided to take that out. But it could be something, certainly we take that on board. It could be something to be considered once we review all the data sets. And again, I don't know which one of you mentioned about swimming pools and laundry, for example. With swimming pools, we've only got 2 sites with swimming pools, and with mechanically ventilated car parks, we only have 3 sites. So if you have a site that does have those facilities, please feel free to provide them, and we'll have a call to action later on. I might move on to the next question, because residential aged care is actually a little bit more straightforward compared to retirement living.
Sorry, Grace, can I interrupt for you a sec? Rita
yes.
wants to ask something.
Yes.
Yeah, she's got her hand up.
Sorry. I'm just following up on what Alex was saying about the level of amenity. And Alex, I'm just wondering whether or not the gross floor area per resident generally will reflect the more sort of larger racks that offer more space, rooms for different types of activities. So perhaps when you were talking about the, the amenity impacting, well, that maybe be able to be measured by the gross floor area per resident with some agreed rules on the assumptions of that. Just throwing the thought in.
The question of gross floor area is certainly one which we've been looking at quite closely, because it does seem like a sensible way of capturing that sort of difference in general amenity. Challenge has been the measurement of it. Some of the gross floor area data we have received is, orders of magnitude implausible. So it creates some challenges. It would be better if we could find other variables that people actually normally measure to capture that. And I'm not saying I have any idea what those variables are. And to a large extent, I think our critical issue here is that there is a level of service issue to be addressed, but we don't really have the number to describe it. And that's possibly what we need to try and capture.
Irene?
Yeah, hi, sorry. Hi, everyone. Listen, we've just finished a brand new high-rise development. We just got residential aged care and retirement living. And we've got an old site, which has got an old hostel, 5 cluster houses and blah, blah. And the old villa style. And one of the things that I think really does need to be measured as a variable is the building code and standard that you're currently occupying and living in. So with the new build, we've put in different air conditioning systems, we've put in different lighting systems, so it's totally LED. There's a lot of turn on, turn off as you walk in the room, which can be controlled. Fans in bathrooms can be controlled. So there's all of those things, and that's part of that building code, and that's the same with the retirement living. So I guess that would be a measure for me, is what is the standard of building that you're actually, and the type of infrastructure that supports that building. What have you offset already in the way of solar or different types of energy use? And for a lot of laundries, a lot of people use gas as an offset. So there are those variables that I think need to be played as well. And the other thing with the high rise, depending on, I suppose, your state base, but you also have to have a large quantity of water tanks to be able to be used if there's a fire or emergency on site, and that obviously has to be continually topped up and kept at a level, whereas in a flat site you don't necessarily need to do that because you've got a different requirement under the DFIS or your fire brigade regulations. So I think there's some of the variables that I think we need to make sure that we're measuring, and I guess we're new in what we've got, but I would imagine, I'm hoping that we get some efficiencies out of what we put into this new build over a 12-month period, but we're yet to find out what that looks like. And, you know, from a maintenance perspective, not just the use of energy as well.
Paul, I wonder if it's worth that we spend a couple minutes talking about the age of buildings and when buildings were constructed, because it's often a topic that comes in NABERS ratings. And it's probably a good time in the project, I think, to address it now. What do you think, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a general point to address here about what the NABERS rating is trying to do, which is provide an indicator of efficiency. So if we correct for energy efficiency features, we actually remove that signal. So we want your new building with fantastic energy efficiency in it, energy efficiency features in it, to get a better rating than a grubby old building where everything runs continuously and the chillers are old and all this sort of stuff. So we don't want to correct for those factors. In fact, it's that variation that we want to measure. And that also then goes for building age as well. So you know, older buildings may or may not be less efficient. They may also just be, they may use less energy but have poorer services, which is the other thing which sometimes happens. Again, we don't want to confuse the rating signal, which is about effectively intensity of energy and water use, with those additional variables. So what we're looking for are functional differences, like things that can say this building is not comparable to that building because it provides a different level of service or a different type of service. Because that then means that we are pulling ourselves back to this idea of an apples for apples comparison. We don't want to be comparing one site that provides a low level of service with a site that provides a high level of service on the same scale without correction, because it wouldn't be fair, a fair comparison. So that's, in looking for these additional factors, we're really looking for those indicators of service.
Yeah, and Paul, what I would add with that is that, yeah, you know, if we really generalize, it is probably true in many cases. A building built to the latest energy efficiency standards of the code may be more energy efficient than a building built 30 years ago. But actually, we have lots of data on other markets showing that it's actually not only not always true, but often not true at all. So the fact that a building was built to the 2019 building code on paper should have been really energy efficient doesn't mean that happens in practice. And in fact, we see a lot of buildings using, for example, twice as much as people think they're going to use from design to performance. That's not that rare. And also in you know, the real reason why you see a building that is older often you know, using more energy is not because they're providing a different service to anyone. It's because you know, maybe that equipment, no equipment in that building's been touched in 20 or 30 years. So it's a more inefficient, you know, every feature is more inefficient. Maybe no one's managing that energy very actively, but it's not because the building couldn't be energy efficient. It's because the management and or the equipment is actually significantly more inefficient. So that's the kind of things that we want reflected in a rating. If you're using 3 or 4 times more energy than another building, you want to see that reflected in differences in star ratings. And I think from our experience in offices, for example, there's lots of data these days on buildings from the 70s and 80s people put a lot of work into improving them. And often a lot of those buildings outperform buildings that are new built this year. So we've seen lots of buildings in other markets, in shopping centers as well, a few markets where you know, buildings can drop, you know, 50, 60, 70% of energy consumption over time. So that's one of the reasons why we don't capture age, because we do get high performing buildings that are older, and buildings that are new can also be really poor performing.
Yeah, thanks, Carlos. Just can we switch gears back into, there was a question which Grace really wanted an answer to about like the both components. If we have an aged care component and a retirement living component, is that a correct assumption that if we sum both of them up, it is the total facility, or there is something we are missing here? So would there be any insights? I think we've got Anthony from RFBI. and they have some co-located sites. Anthony, would you be able to put some light on that?
Yep, so all of our sites are separately metered. Sorry, with our retirement side of things, they're all separately metered for each resident. We didn't provide those details for the NABERS purpose. We've only provided common areas, street lights, community halls, and I think there was one shared laundry, and all residential facilities have their own metering as well.
That's you've provided us with the correct data there, Anthony, so that's great. The I suppose the question is whether if we think about, you've got a combined site that is aged care and retirement living, in the formulation of the benchmarks, we are effectively saying, well, looking at a bunch of aged care sites, this is what an aged care site looks like. Looking at retirement living, this is what retirement living looks like. So the question is, if we've got a combined site, can we just say we'll have some of that aged care and some of that retirement living and add the two as if they were effectively independent functions, so that your site would be just the same effectively as it would be if they were separate sites, just happen to be co-located, or whether there is a significant crossover that gives a sharing of facilities that means that straight addition doesn't quite make sense.
Can I comment on that? There's the direction of aged care is very much integrated retirement living, and new projects that I'm working on with various care providers are looking at when the retirement village is being built, that village will in fact be developed such that it can be a full equivalent to RACF. So the direction of residential aged care is allowing that. So I think it's critical that somehow the tool does allow the crossover, or has a combined method, because that is the future of where we are heading. I guess there will still be some sites that will be just retirement villages where people aren't interested in providing that high level of continuing care, but there's a lot of care providers who are looking towards that in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And the reason why we're asking the question, I suppose, is we have a smaller data set for combined sites, and we want to check our assumptions about how we might accurately assess those. We haven't gone into, because we're still looking at the standalone sites, we haven't gone into the combined sites in detail yet, but I suppose we just wanted to check our understanding of how those combined sites might operate. Irene?
Yeah, look, I hear what Sue's saying, and I guess my only concern would be who's going to see the data, and what is the data going to be used for? Because if you look at the retirement village space, it is actually under the state government legislation, and there's memorials around that and all of those things. And it's about how you do that budgeting and that legislation. However, and residential aged care is separately funded. So from my perspective, it is going to be about who sees the data and then how that might be interpreted. I'd be very disappointed to think that it landed up at Treasury and then going, oh, well, this is how much the benchmark is, blah, blah, when it's actually, they're two separate funded and legislated areas. So I'm not sure whether that comes into your thing, but it's more about who sees the data and where that data, how it's going to be used.
I think, and Carlos might want to have something to say about this as well, but I think the question of how the rating will be used depends a bit on the sector. I don't think we're necessarily expecting it to be used in state/Commonwealth funding considerations, but we, from experience in other sectors, we would expect it to be considered in, portfolio level sustainability decisions, and indeed in investor level sustainability decisions, and at which point the boundaries between the two become less important, because people are looking at it as an asset rather than the two pieces. Open question though. I'm not going to pretend that I've got a final answer on that one at all.
Yeah, no, Paul, what I would say is that, Irene, I think we totally hear you. I think that's part of the reason we spend so much time in this phase on collecting data and try to create basically the best benchmarks that we can, is that we know that a significant portion of residential aged care are going to be standalone buildings today as of 2020. A significant portion of retirement living facilities and villages will be also standalone. And some of them will be mixed. And the challenge with our design is that we want a residential aged care facility with certain features to be compared fairly against others with the same features, right? And we want the same for retirement living. And often what we may find in the space in between is that you might have a facility that is 80% retirement living and 20% residential aged care. And I think that this is the kind of things that we think we can capture in this rating tool, especially following some of the comments that Sue was making. But that doesn't mean us capturing well some of these mixed facilities doesn't mean that we couldn't have really good benchmarks for residential aged care alone or retirement living alone. And it's partly why we start from the base of, let's start with the purest sites that are the most representative, and then which is the simplest to compare, if you will. And then let's take that and go into the more complex sites, which are mixed, and see if there's anything, sometimes we mix those two, and the result of this combined benchmark already works right away, or sometimes we need to do a bit of tweaking. So that's what we're taking as sort of in a two-phase role. But at the end of the day, if we get really good benchmarks that work for most buildings at this level, based on as much data as we can, often the uses later on work really well, because people get a fair comparison against similar buildings in the same climate zone with the same characteristics, and that facilitates all the uses that we can think of today for a rating, but also the ones that are going to come up in 3 or 4 years that we're not even thinking about.
I'm just conscious of time, where there's a really interesting discussion. There's also a very interesting discussion going on in the chat. But I'm aware about how much time we had allocated for this section of the discussion. We're already over it. We haven't finished the discussion. So we might have to find a way of moving on.
I think we can move on now, Paul.
Grace, did you want me to launch this poll?
Oh, no, don't worry about the poll now.
Okay,
we'll do it
cool.
right at the end. So it's polls. Next slide.
Okay, so for retirement living, we got, as you saw in the earlier slide, quite a lot of data across quite a wide range of states and therefore climates, which is great. We also got a reasonable mix of sites offering independent dwellings, independent apartments, and service apartments. Again, creating some mix of service types. Next slide. So again, the starting question is, what's our primary scale variable? We had a look at a number of variables, noting here, remembering that we are essentially assessing the the clubhouse central facilities here, not the units themselves. And although I note the comment about servicing, and it's something we possibly need to follow up. There's a comment in the chat about the level of servicing provided to independent units. At the moment, we're working on the assumption that the independent units are completely independent, and they have received no central services. Our starting point, however, is a fairly weak correlation. You see the R-squared there is at 21% for total number of independent living units. So that's not great. We do get a slightly better correlation with site area, but that basically doesn't really survive the cut as we work further into the analysis. Next slide. One of the things that we did recognize is that obviously service departments tend to receive their services from the central services, whereas the independent units generally don't. And so we would expect that while the size of the common area, common facilities may be proportional to the total number of residents, the service departments would have an independent effect. And indeed, that's what we found, that we could pick up a separate effect for service departments and adjust for that as well. Next slide. At the end of all this, however, we still end up with a fairly unsatisfactory position. You'll recall for retirement aged care, so for aged care, we had a predicted versus actual. So, how much of the variation does our benchmark explain? Of about 50%. Here it's about 30%. Having been involved in a lot of NABERS benchmarks, I start getting happy when we reach 70%, and I feel we've really explained what's going on. So we have a similar issue here, and in fact a stronger issue with retirement living, that we don't really feel we've got a handle of all of the parameters that define the differences between the sites that are functional as opposed to merely efficiency related. Next slide. Okay, or we'll come back to that. I'll just quickly go through for water. For water, we get a slightly better starting point, and it's interesting looking at the right-hand graph there. You can see evidence of good grouping of data below the line, which suggests that we've got a group of sites, and then we have these sort of sites that use a lot more water, which feasibly could be leakage, or it could be irrigation, or other factors like that. Next slide. There are a number of second order effects that we've investigated, including meals, service departments, and heavy laundry, all of which have small, particularly the laundry has a plausible impact, which is not surprising because laundry typically uses the orders of 6 to 10 liters per kilogram of laundry, so you don't need a lot of laundry to have an impact. We did look at GFA and site area per resident to try and understand the potential for irrigation or just overall facility size. We couldn't get any significant effect there. We tried pools and we couldn't get any significant effect there. So we have some second order effects that we're still investigating for water. And I suppose at this stage, I feel that while we've explained, as this graph shows, 53% of the variation in the data for water, we also have a few tricks up our sleeves still. So we're less worried about that than we are for the emissions data. So the same question does apply for both water and for both water and emissions, but particularly for emissions, and which is, what are the factors, the service factors, the level of service factors that we might not have considered that would explain the spread? From the data we've got, we have been unable to find anything that gives us any further explanation. So it would be very interested to get people's opinions about how the service varies from site to site.
I think Paul, I think I'm gonna ask Kalpesh, because Stockland is doing a lot of retirement living, and I'm gonna throw that question on Kalpesh there, if he can give us a little bit insight on the issues happening here.
Yep, no problem. I guess the first thing is it's quite a challenging space for us too, in terms of just sub-metering for water itself to understand the intricacies of where that water is being used. To some extent, when we do see large water usage, that could be a combination of leaks, or it could just be a combination of very active users. It also goes to the level of services within those villages. So some have bowling greens, actually most do. Some might have fountains and other water features that then chew up also water. Residents themselves might be very keen on washing their cars and doing irrigation to their own spaces. They might be in active groups where they do things within the communities themselves in their common spaces. There might be gardening that occurs, or veggie patches or things that then also consume water. Pools themselves, like there might be internal and external pools that then impact, and the level of ones that have pool covers or don't have pool covers, heated, unheated. There's just a multitude of variation. In terms of air conditioning systems, there might be ones that work off adiabatic processes instead of refrigerant ones. So water in itself is used in many different ways.
Thanks, Kalpesh. Yeah, Paul, please take it.
Yeah, that's very useful. And again, we have to try and draw the boundary between what is a coverage question and what is an efficiency question, and then what is a service question. So a lot of those things are use questions. I had one very fundamental question I wanted to ask, just following what you said, and that is the water use within independent units that typically have their own electricity metering, is that on the main meter for the site as a whole? So, or is there separate water provision to those individual units?
A bit of both, really. So some have their own water meters, some have it off just the main meter, and then it's a service charge for water, essentially, to the residents.
So there's one issue that we haven't necessarily captured, I think, within our data collection. Just looking at the equivalent question in energy, and Jonathan Dalton's raised this in the group chat. For emissions, we've largely assumed that an independent unit is wholly independent, so all its energy consumption is effectively outside the capture of the rating, based on what happens with independent villas, for instance, and townhouses. But the question then comes, if we've got an apartment, are there situations where there is some central provision of service to the independent apartments, or would those independent apartments tend to have completely independent services, or is it a mix?
Can be a bit of both. So for air conditioning, typically they would be served by the units themselves, so running through their own electricity provisions. For hot water, we're seeing centralized services is typically the way. Whether then it's fueled by gas or electricity is a separate question. But typically in apartments, it is central services for hot water.
Okay, that's so I think that does point to some additional thinking we need to do with the data, because I don't think we have that level of clarity in the numbers we're looking at the moment. Just to go back a step, for the individual villas, though, would we be reasonable, and indeed the townhouses, reasonable in assuming that they would have completely standalone services, so that if we subtracted the apartment components from, remove the apartment components, we should get a clean signal, whereas all the messy stuff sounds like it's in where there are apartments.
Essentially, yes, I'd say so. For the horizontal villages, i.e. those that are single occupancy dwelling type ones, standalone villas, then there wouldn't be really any centralized services shared amongst them.
Okay, terrific. Thank you.
Peter, would you like to give some insights from Retire Australia as well, or Jeff?
Yeah, I think completions nailed it with the mixture of different villages, with sub-metering and so forth. We suffer from that, particularly with different ratings that council even give us for the cost of water. You know, if you've got a commercial operation happening in one of your community centres, you could be rated commercially where you need to sub-meter it to take that out of the equation. And also too, there's a lot of assumptions made at meter readings as well by various councils. So sub-metering you know, allows us to get a much more accurate picture on just where the water's going. But yeah, with the horizontal villages, yes, some are metered individually and some through the 1 metre, so that makes it rather difficult. And particularly,
yeah, we do have a lot of the embedded networks, don't we, Pete? So that makes it a lot harder. And I guess also, you know, we're talking about age before with the rack stuff. You know, it's the same thing with retirement living in that same sector, where, you know, you're zoning with your AC units, you know, might be broadly across a communal area, whereas with your newer build, new dev and stuff like that, you can certainly set zones for your AC. So that does make a big difference as well. And not only that, you know, some of our sites do offer meals, you know, our service department sites that have retirement living, independent living as well, do offer meals to those that are living in the independent living units. So, you know, that's another variable as well, which hasn't really been captured that great. So yeah, it's one of the things too.
Carlos, I think you got your hand up. Yeah.
Yeah. No, well, just to answer to that one, Jeff, I think that's a good point, and we can definitely look into that. Paul, I was going to pass on a question from Elizabeth a little while back, and she's asking about whether climate is actually considered in this first pass of the statistics. And by the way, Elizabeth, we usually do in the final model. But we often only introduce that variable once we have enough data from the different cities in different climates to be able to do that. Paul, I know that in residential aged care, we're not quite there yet because we have lots of data from New South Wales, not so much from a lot of the other states, but I think in retirement living, we have a bit more of a mixed portfolio of data. Is this, you know, 30% R square, is that already, you know, have we introduced a climate correction there already or not yet?
No, we haven't. And it's probably fair to say, I wouldn't expect it. I mean, it would be a component of the explanation, but wouldn't expect it to be the totality of the explanation. But it's we haven't got as far as correlating the residuals with climate, which is how we'd check that. We certainly will, and as I say, my suspicion is that it will have some impact, but it won't necessarily get us to where I'd like to be.
I can confirm that it's very small. You know, we want to try to correlate with the larger contributors first, but even just looking at it now, it's very small or negligible.
One of the reasons for that is that we tend to get a bit of a balancing between heating and cooling. So you get sites in cold areas which use a lot of heating and sites in hot areas that use a lot of cooling, and the two cancel each other out a little bit to create a smaller than you would expect effect. Nonetheless, it is absolutely a variable that we will include in the rating when we've finalised the benchmarks.
So I might jump in. How are we going with this section, Grace and Paul? We're, apart from wildly over time, it's been really interesting listening and having all of your input. Where would you like to head next? We were hoping to have a brief section on what you can do with your NABERS ratings, but I think there's probably a couple of last bits you wanted to wrap up with first.
Yes, if we could just run the poll, the second poll. So that's just a question to everyone. For residential aged care, if you could provide data for other states, and also for retirement living, the facilities that we're talking about are what we just discussed. If you could provide any data or additional data on that. If you can, please leave your name, a company or contact details in the chat box. Just send it via private message to Suruchi or Supra or someone from the NABERS team, and then we'll follow up with you shortly after.
Yeah, the poll should have popped up for you now, if it's not there. direct message would be great. Can anyone not see the poll? Supra, you can't see the poll? Well, I guess you won't be providing us any data then.
We will definitely keep working on our customers and contacts in WA to try and get some more data. We've definitely been talking with them, and one provider has committed, but they via email and said we will work on it. But yeah, due to time constraints and other pressing issues, they just haven't been able to summarize those pieces of information. But yeah, we're definitely seeing where we can help and get you guys some more information for WA.
Okay, excellent. Well, I think we can close that poll. We won't share the results. That's all right. Just as quickly, next slide, please. Oh, right, sorry, next steps. So we've just pulled a poll to see if you could provide more data. We'll be in touch with you if you send a message to Supra and Suruchi. Also, coming out from this advisory panel meeting, we may actually go back to some of the existing data providers to ask for very specific additional data. The next step that will actually happen in terms of the NABERS development pathway, aside from us trying to build a good benchmark, is we will be doing trial ratings in sort of around the March period once we've actually developed the benchmark and the rules. What we'll be doing is looking at about 15 sites from the pool of sites that provided data. We'll be looking for a mix of sites in different locations, different sizes, maybe different, maybe you're for not-for-profit or if you're for-profit organizations, the size of the facility and any other features that we deem as important. So what we want to know right now is if you are interested in putting your facility in one of these first few trial rating sites, please let us know. Again, private message the NABERS team, or when we follow up after this session, please let us know as well. We can't guarantee that all of your sites can get those trial ratings, which I understand, Supra, you can correct me if I'm wrong, will get a certified rating. But it's a great chance for you to see how your site's doing. Supra, over to you.
All right, so we're on to next steps, Grace. Supra, Suruchi.
Sorry, I was having some Zoom issues. So just in terms of next step, just very quickly wrapping up, what we'll do is we'll follow up with an email and essentially provide kind of summarize some of the key discussion items from this meeting, and follow up with on providing us with some more data, volunteer sites for the trial ratings, as Grace mentioned, and then there'll be a survey on what Esther will also cover, which I think we'll talk to in a bit, and we'll kind of follow up with a survey on that as well. And we'll also send across a placeholder for the next advisory panel meeting as well in March.
We can pass it to Esther to flag the survey a little bit. I think we had a little bit of presentation. Esther, I don't know if we have time or not.
Yes, I think we definitely do. We've got about 10 more minutes. So yes, we'll pass over to Esther. Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. So my name's Esther. I'm the head of market development for NABERS. As many of you I've not met yet, but I am really excited to do so. And as you get further through the progression of the tool, you're likely to see a bit more of me. So thank you very much. You are in the hardest bit, which is, getting all of that data out and crawling through it to find those trends. But I hope you can see how much your contribution is valuable and makes this the best tool that it can be, and how much we are really committed to really putting data, high quality data, at the center of this. So at the end, you get a tool that you are confident is robust and helps you to compare between sites. But that's not the only thing that NABERS wants to do for you, and it's not the only thing we do for our customers in our other sectors. So once you've got that tool, my team kind of comes to the fore and says, okay, well, how do we help you to use that? How do we help you to get maximum impact from that great annual rating process that you're now taking up? So I was going to lead us through a bit of a conversation in this section. Because of the limited time, what I might do is just take you through a few of the things we're doing in other segments, just by way of inspiration, just to zoom us out and get us thinking about the kinds of ways in which we could use this tool. And then perhaps you might go away and think about how some of those things may be relevant for your businesses. So we're of course very aware that all our businesses are very different and they're at different stages of maturity in terms of their sustainability journey. And so not everyone is the same. And that's okay, but there is incredible power in a cohort like this to be able to learn from each other and to really lift everyone up as well. And we've seen that in all of the other sectors we work in. However, you know, firmly those different players compete in the market, there is still things that we can all learn and do better together. And NABERS is very committed to assisting you with that. So this slide in front of us is just a kind of a bit of a sort of selection pack of those things that we do. Of course, we want to provide that ongoing tracking and indicators so that you can make those iterative improvements over time. And we want to help you send a really strong signal to your market, to your customers, your staff, and to the investor community about how you are committed to creating healthy and happy spaces for people to live, work and play in. We also have a number of financial co-benefits that we find arise through the use of our rating system. So I just was going to step you through three in particular today in those remaining slides. So the first question is, how can NABERS help you to unlock that improved performance across your assets once we've got this tool in place? And next one, please, Supra. And there are a number of ways that we've seen our customers use NABERS in order to track and manage performance. And so many of you may have ongoing information systems where you're capturing data. But one of the things we see our customers is quite transformative is when those translate into targets at a corporate level, which are then communicated down through the organization. So do you have KPIs inside of your facilities managers? When you procure goods in the market, are you setting service level expectations around improved performance for sustainability? There are a number of customers on the call that we know do that well, and there be maybe many of you who have not done that previously. So in our next session, we might unpack that in a little bit more time and learn from some of the leaders and see how people are using those to really align incentives down the supply chain and make sure that your technical service providers are incentivized for supporting those performance improvements with you, and see how you can put NABERS inside of your procurement documentation too. Moving on from there, Supra, I'll just spend a little bit of time talking about some of our other tools. So we are also fully integrated with the New South Wales Energy Savers Scheme, which enables people who do a NABERS rating and then achieve a half-star improvement or more on their previous rating to claim certificates which will assist in the funding of upgrade projects. So we have a new method that we use with NABERS, and you're really just claiming on that differential. So if you've already baked in a routine of reporting, then you are able to claim value in order to support your upgrade projects. We've got webinars coming up on this in the next couple of weeks, and fact sheets are available, and please reach out if you'd like some more information about how that might work for you. We are looking at alignments with South Australian system as well. There is a NABERS rating in the Victorian system as well, and we're doing a lot of work to make sure that those processes are aligned as they can be for people who've got a national set of assets. Thanks, Supra. So that's at a kind of operational asset level and really putting some fuel to your ongoing performance improvements. But we can also assist with acquiring finance at that broader scale and communicating with your investors for the people on the call for whom that's relevant. So just a couple of, for instances, and how we are working in that sector. So this is an extract from Real Investment Analytics, who track a number of financial metrics for performance across, this is from the office sector, our most mature tool. And what you can see from that ongoing quarter by quarter tracking, this is over the previous 5 years, that highly rated NABERS rating buildings do definitively secure longer leases, have lower vacancy rates, and have a higher asset value, because the market can factor in that high quality performance and that commitment to excellence, which is visible from a high NABERS rating. So there'll be different drivers, of course, in your sector, but I think it's important to just put some evidence on the table that says actually this kind of investment is worth it over the long haul for improving your asset valuations and returns
Esther?
as well.
Can I just make a quick comment about this slide? The Sydney at the bottom of those graphs is actually an oversight. It's like these are national figures, and you can see similar statistics in all capital cities in the office market, not just in Sydney.
Thank you for that pickup, very useful. Super, next one, please. If anybody does have questions as I'm going through this, I know I'm going at pace, but I'm very happy to stop if you've got particular questions or drop something into the chat. So we've got a number of other tools as well that we're working on to assist with driving investment capital into residential aged care and retirement living sectors. We know there's a strong burgeoning interest in green bonds that are looking to invest in high performance asset. And we also know that there's a lot of interest in social impact bonds. The measurement metrics on those have proven a little more elusive, but actually using a NABERS rating is a very well established mechanism for demonstrating either your aspiration or your achievement for people who want to provide preferential rates of capital or give you access into green bonds in the market. So we can clearly, once we've got a strong and active cohort, identify what the top 15% of that looks like, which meets the criteria for a number of bond issuers, including the Climate Bonds Initiative. But what we're also seeing from a whole bunch of the banks is this real appetite to provide sustainability linked capital, where you can access preferential rates by committing to make a change, from much like we saw in the energy savings scheme. So if you commit to come up a star rating at an asset or a portfolio level, then they will provide capital on that basis. We have a tool called the Sustainable Portfolio Index. Sorry, I was just trying to look at what Saruchi wanted to jump in. We have a tool called the Sustainable Portfolio Index. It's available on our website, worth a little look between now and when we next meet, to see how we then collect up those asset level performances into portfolio and demonstrate that back to the market. So for our superannuation funds or the more kind of investor exposed, this is a really useful tool, and it complements your ESG commitments through your environmental social governance, any net zero commitments that you might have, with actual evidence of how you're traveling along that trajectory of performance. So have a little look through the SPI, and then we might have a conversation when next we meet about whether a tool like this has value for your particular circumstance. Thanks, Supra. And then the last piece of the puzzle that we will unpack the next time we meet is really to create happy spaces for our older generations, and for people to feel comfortable and happy to put their families in place. Thank you. Next slide, Super. On how we can communicate that with you. So what would you want to see as you inside of your brochures? What do you want people to feel about that commitment to NABERS as they come into your reception area? We provide a whole suite of branding and guidelines and support, and we're very open to exploring what else is valuable and useful for you. So in our mature sectors, we are routinely used in annual reports. We're routinely used in brochures. Sometimes it's on the hoardings outside of the front of buildings, either for mandatory or for voluntary purposes. So it's very important to us that all this amazing work that occurs behind the scenes also provides value to the people who live and work in your spaces. So we've got 5 minutes left for wrap up. I'm happy to take any questions about those things that you've seen. If that was a bit too much of a rapid kind of rustle through, I think what we will do is put a little bit more time into our next meeting, when hopefully we'll be a bit further through the benchmarking, we'll be a bit more settled, and we can start to lift our eyes up to think about what other things would be helpful for you. I'm also really aware that we've got a number of peak bodies on the call as well, and I think they have a really powerful position to play in terms of bedding this this kind of capability building and support for industry, and we are very happy to have conversations with you offline about how we can support that too. After this, because you're all quite different, it's quite useful for us to see how each of you are traveling across some of these different dimensions, as well as a group conversation. So with your permission, we'll send a little survey as well, just to get a bit of a temperature check about what kinds of things are useful to you. We will not make that anonymized, because I want to be able to use that to actually come back to you and help you specifically, which I can't do with a, a big data pool. So please watch out for that. Please take a little bit of time, and it will just be a prompt for conversation. And I hope you find a substantial amount of value beyond our core rating products. Thank you.
Thanks, Esther. Were there any questions? No, everyone's keen. All right, well, look, thank you everyone. Thanks for your input. Thank you to those of you who have provided us with data. You can see what we're doing with it now, and you'll see even more in the next meeting in March. If you do have other data to provide, or you've got new data to provide, please contact Super and Saruchi, or they'll be in touch with you, no doubt. This meeting's been great, thank you. We've got a lot of leads, and I think that's really helped DeltaQ start to frame up some more of the factors that are going to influence the benchmarking. No doubt we or DeltaQ will be in touch with some of you to clarify any of that. If you want to call though, we would, we're not happy to receive calls. We're absolutely delighted and keen to make calls and engage with you. So if you have specific questions or more general ones, we'd love to make time and have a chat about it. And that's really it. So best wishes for a relaxing, and I think after this year, uneventful break if you're having one. And I look forward to seeing you all at our next meeting in March.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, guys. Cheers.